The air in the Oxford University Physics Department offices, usually thick with the scent of old paper and lukewarm tea, now carried a distinct metallic tang, the residue of late-night tension and existential dread. Dr. Alastair Finch, a man whose tweed jacket and perpetually dishevelled hair marked him as a quintessential British academic, stood hunched over a bank of monitors. He wasn't looking at textbooks or standard astronomical data. He was staring into a digital abyss, tracking an object so anomalous, so impossibly behaved, that the mere suggestion of its true nature had already cost him his reputation. Finch had always been known for his sharp mind and his unfortunate propensity for embracing the esoteric. While his peers were comfortably mapping gravitational distortions and calculating the precise rotation of mundane stellar dust, Finch was preoccupied with the fringe, the historical outliers, the whispers of Sumerian antiquity that occasionally brushed against modern astrophysics. He was, to put it mildly, considered a bit of a crank, a brilliant but ultimately unreliable bloke who should stick to calculating planetary transits instead of dreaming up ancient astronaut theories. His office, a testament to his divided loyalties, was half high-tech computing cluster, half dusty library dedicated to cuneiform translation. The contrast was stark, the scent of expensive circuitry battling the musty aroma of ancient clay and leather-bound translation guides. The object in question, initially catalogued as 1E Oumuamua, and now followed by its strange successor, the interstellar comet designated C 2019 Q4 Borisov, and later the truly baffling 3I Atlas, was the physical manifestation of his greatest fears and highest hopes. These weren't simply rogue asteroids or comets slung out of distant solar systems, passive debris following the cold, mechanical dictates of gravity. No. Their velocity, their non-gravitational acceleration, their inexplicable lack of a visible coma despite high solar proximity, these were signatures of control. They defied every known principle of celestial mechanics, mocking the comfortable, predictable cosmos that mainstream science so diligently protected. The data, meticulously collected by dozens of instruments worldwide, painted a picture of deliberate maneuvering, a subtlety that only the most dedicated or perhaps the most desperate researcher would dare acknowledge. Finch adjusted his thick-rimmed spectacles, the fluorescent lights reflecting sharply off the lenses, creating tiny points of blinding white in the gloom. The silence of the deserted observatory complex pressed in on him, broken only by the rhythmic hum of the servers and the distant, lonely clang of a night porter securing a far-off laboratory door downstairs, ensuring all was snug for the night. He traced the trajectory of 3I Atlas on the screen. It was moving fast, faster than anything they had ever tracked, yet its path was far too clean, too purposeful. It wasn't tumbling haphazardly through space, subject to the random chaos of the void. It was navigating, its course adjusted with minute precision that hinted at an intelligence guiding its passage through the crowded highways of the solar system. "A proper smoking gun," he muttered to himself, pulling a chipped porcelain mug closer. The porcelain was the standard university issue, bearing the faded crest of the physics faculty. The tea inside was stone cold, a forgotten brew from hours earlier, but the caffeine had long since ceased to be his fuel. Now his fuel was the chilling realization that humanity was not alone, and perhaps more terrifyingly, that the gods of antiquity might be observing their own return schedule, operating on a clock far grander than any human calendar. The official narrative was straightforward, presented with the practiced, detached confidence of established authority. Natural phenomena, observational error, gas expulsion causing minor acceleration. Textbook stuff, designed to soothe the public and maintain the comfortable facade of scientific certainty, ensuring the funding streams remained stable and the press kept its focus on manageable, predictable discoveries. But Finch knew that behind the closed doors of international astronomical consortiums, the whispers were getting louder, filled with fear and confusion. The data didn't lie, especially when viewed through the lens of non-conventional models. The objects were non-natural. They were artifacts, relics of a technology far surpassing human capability, sent perhaps as probes or more ominously as advanced reconnaissance units. He leaned back, the chair groaning under his weight, the leather worn and cracked from decades of academic wear and tear, bearing the imprints of countless scientists who had shared the same spot but never the same terrifying insight. The ancient Sumerian tablets, which he kept hidden in a dusty folder marked "Rejected Grant Proposals," a sardonic title hiding secrets that could topple civilization, spoke of the Nibirans, the Anunnaki, the visitors who came every 3,600 years to tend to their terrestrial experiments. The timing, the cosmic alignments, the very presence of these interstellar visitors, it was all converging, a frightening synchronicity that demanded attention, weaving myth and mathematics into a single, cohesive, terrifying tapestry. His heart pounded against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the overwhelming quiet of the late hour. If this object, this seemingly innocuous comet, was indeed an advanced scout, a herald preparing the way for the return of the ancient rulers, then everything, human history, theology, and even the future of civilization, was about to undergo a radical, terrifying re-evaluation. This wasn't just science, this was a historical reckoning delivered from the depths of interstellar space by an agency that viewed Earth as a strategic asset rather than a unique cradle of life. He needed to share this, but who would listen to a scientist already branded as eccentric? Who would believe that the very mythologies they dismissed as primitive superstition were about to manifest as an existential threat? The academic isolation he had cultivated now felt like a curse, isolating him from the very people he needed to convince. If this beginning has already made you rethink what you thought you knew, imagine what is coming next. So go on and leave your like and subscribe to the channel right now, because here, every video reveals something few dare to show. Finch pushed the mug aside and brought up a side-by-side comparison of the 3-eye Atlas trajectory and the predicted orbital path of the mythical planet X, or Nibiru, as described in the controversial works of Zecharia Sitchin. Mainstream academics dismiss Sitchin as a sensationalist charlatan, a populist purveyor of historical inaccuracies, but Finch was starting to see mathematics where others only saw mythology. The convergence was too precise to be random, too statistically improbable. The orbital plane, the inclination, the period, it was a near-perfect match for the 3,600-year cycle described in the ancient Sumerian clay tablets, suggesting the ancients were far more sophisticated observers than modern historians allowed. The sheer arrogance of the academic establishment, which preferred to discard thousands of years of human record rather than admit a single celestial anomaly, frustrated him deeply, manifesting as a dull ache in his chest. He thought of his tenure review, the cold clinical dismissal of his theories, the condescending smiles from the faculty heads who viewed him as a dangerous liability. They saw him as a fool, chasing shadows in the margins of accepted science. He knew he was merely tracing the path of giants, following a celestial track millennia in the making. The atmosphere in the room felt heavy, not just with stale air, but with the weight of impending disclosure. He was alone, isolated, but he held the key to potentially the most monumental discovery in human history, or its greatest delusion. The flickering light of the monitor cast long, skeletal shadows across the room, mimicking the ancient, unknowable figures he was now convinced were rapidly approaching Earth. The chill wasn't from the night air, it was the cold dread of knowing the truth. He realized with sickening certainty that the story of humanity was about to be interrupted, perhaps permanently, by its long-forgotten authors. The musty air of the restricted archives beneath the British Museum felt like stepping back into time, a transition Alistair Finch desperately needed. He had traded the sterile digital reality of the observatory for the tangible weight of history, surrounded by the silent record of human antiquity. The walls here, lined with endless shelves of boxes containing fragile, meticulously catalogued artifacts, seemed to breathe the secrets of millennia. Finch, using his old connections and promising a purely academic review of cuneiform translation inconsistencies, a plausible cover story for a linguistically inclined astrophysicist, had secured access to some of the most sensitive Sumerian documentation, far from the public eye. He was searching for a specific term, a descriptor for an object that wasn't a star, wasn't a planet, and wasn't a standard comet, a messenger of the Great Ones, or Lu-Nimgir in the original language. The cuneiform tablets, meticulously organized in climate-controlled drawers and handled only with white cotton gloves, were silent witnesses to the beginning of civilization, the foundational myths etched into clay. Finch ran a gloved finger over the intricate script of a reproduction tablet detailing astronomical observations from approximately 4,000 years before Christ. The precision of the ancient observers was astonishing, mapping out constellations and celestial movements with an accuracy that contemporary archaeology often conveniently ignored, preferring to categorize them as mere myths, poetry, or primitive superstition. He found it, hidden within a convoluted description of celestial omens preceding periods of great upheaval and societal collapse. A reference to a wandering star, swift and cold, which does not obey the shepherd's crook. The shepherd's crook was, contextually, the conventional gravitational pull of the inner solar system planets. Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, the forces that govern the predictable dance of celestial mechanics. This wandering star, the Lu-Nimgir, was a force unto itself, unbound by the normal rules of the gravitational neighborhood. It was the ancient equivalent of Oumuamua and Three-Eye Atlas, a signature of intentionality spanning millennia. Finch's internal world, previously a landscape of complex differential equations and cosmological constants, now shifted toward theology, ancient languages, and forgotten origins. The Anunnaki, described in these texts not as abstract deities or spiritual entities, but as physical beings who arrived via the chariots of fire, advanced spacecraft, were responsible for establishing the first cities, Eridu, Uruk, introducing agriculture and genetically engineering early humanity, the Adamu, to serve as laborers in the gold mines. This was the narrative that official history deemed ludicrous, relegated to the dusty corners of fringe archaeology. Yet Finch saw the pieces clicking into place with frightening clarity. The gold mining was critical, a resource the Anunnaki needed to repair the atmosphere of their home planet, Nibiru, a desperate measure to save their own civilization. He spent hours in the quiet solitude of the archives, the silence broken only by the faint rustle of his movements and the distant, muffled sirens of London traffic filtering down from above, a reminder of the oblivious modern world existing just meters away. He realized the implications were profound. If the Anunnaki were real, and if their cyclic return was imminent, a return timed precisely to the orbit of their home world, then they weren't coming back as benevolent gods offering salvation. They were returning to check on their property, to assess their assets, and potentially to enforce compliance. The urgency of his discovery began to chip away at his composure, replacing scholarly curiosity with existential dread. His hands trembled slightly as he cross-referenced the orbital periods. The Sumerians had been tracking Nibiru for millennia, their civilization itself a direct result of its influence. Their records weren't haphazard drawings. They were sophisticated astronomical charts transcribed onto clay, preserved by chance and the arid climate of Mesopotamia. "Why the secrecy, Alistair?" he whispered. his breath clouding the display case holding a fragile clay cylinder that depicted a winged figure descending from the sky. Why has this been actively suppressed, not just dismissed? The answer, chillingly, was preservation, the preservation of control. Mainstream science, backed by powerful governmental and theological institutions, could not afford the paradigm shift. The concept of an interventionist alien race responsible for human evolution destroys the foundations of virtually every modern political and religious structure, undermining the very notion of human autonomy. It wasn't about verifying data. It was about maintaining control over the narrative of creation and destiny. If you have made it this far without pausing, it's because this has deeply resonated with you. So, strengthen this content, like it now, and send it to someone who needs to see this. The weight of the knowledge settled on him like a heavy, suffocating woolen blanket on a damp British evening. He had data, he had ancient textual correlation. What he lacked was undeniable, visual proof that the objects were artificial, that the signal was manufactured, not merely cosmic noise. He needed to track 3i Atlas continuously, far away from the prying eyes and restrictive protocols of the Oxford establishment, which was already riddled with institutional denial. He needed to vanish from the grid. He needed to find a place where the air was clean, the surveillance was minimal, and the telescopes were pointed towards the deepest void. Scotland, perhaps. A remote part of the Highlands or the Islands, where the isolation was absolute and the sky was dark, where the sheer geography provided a natural defense against intrusion. The pursuit of truth, he mused grimly, often requires becoming a fugitive from polite society. Alistair's small, cramped flat in North London was a monument to academic disarray. Stacks of journals, printouts, and half-eaten packets of digestive biscuits leaned precariously against bookshelves, groaning under the weight of cosmological histories and obscure Assyriology texts. Outside, the familiar symphony of London nightlife, the distant whoop of a police car, the fuzz, the shouting and laughter filtering from a nearby pub served as a background chorus to the unraveling of his life and the impending existential crisis. He packed with a frantic, systematic energy. Not clothes, not food, but hard drives, encrypted data sticks, and his most valuable possession, a vintage Celestron telescope equipped with bespoke, highly sensitive detectors capable of measuring extremely faint light curves and spectral analysis, the kind of work that had earned him the eccentric label, but which might now save the world or at least document its impending change. He treated the equipment with the reverence usually reserved for religious relics, wrapping each piece carefully in foam padding. The 3i Atlas object was the key. Unlike Oumuamua, which was small and vanished quickly, Atlas had lingered in the outer solar system. Its trajectory suggested a pass rather than a slingshot, a controlled deceleration that defied natural forces. Finch had calculated the delta V, change in velocity, required for such a maneuver, and found it astronomically high, unless the object was harnessing some form of unknown propulsion, perhaps exploiting zero-point energy or some hyper-efficient fusion drive. The scientific community, however, preferred to blame radiometers or asymmetric outgassing, convenient conservative fictions designed to avoid uncomfortable conclusions that threatened their established models. Finch scrolled through the raw data one last time. The anomaly wasn't just in the speed, it was in the light signature. He had detected minute periodic fluctuations in the object's brightness, too regular to be tumbling, too structured to be random solar reflection. It suggested rotation, yes, but a controlled rotation, perhaps for stabilization or, more alarmingly, for communication, or perhaps even the deployment of cloaking technology designed to mimic a natural celestial body. The journey north was carefully planned to maximize misdirection. He couldn't risk flying, airports were too controlled, too monitored by the vast electronic surveillance systems of the state. He needed anonymity, He booked a series of intercity train tickets, broken up by long, tedious coach journeys, gradually making his way up the spine of Britain, past the Midlands and the industrial north, heading towards the rugged isolation of Scotland. He knew the authorities, the intelligence services he suspected were already tracking anomalies, would be looking for a panicked flight, an immediate escape to a non-extradition country. He would present a calm, meandering itinerary, suggesting a sabbatical or a research trip to review historical sites, which technically was true, albeit dangerously incomplete. The view from the carriage window was a blur of emerald green fields and dry stone walls, typical English countryside morphing into the wilder, darker terrain of the Scottish borders, where the peaks grew sharper and the shadows longer. Finch sat clutching his worn leather briefcase, its contents far more valuable than gold or jewels. He watched the other passengers, a young woman intensely focused on her laptop, a retired couple placidly reading the Daily Mail and discussing the price of gas, and wondered how they would react if they knew the celestial mechanism they were currently spinning towards. Would they scream, or would they simply demand to know when the buffet car would open for their lunch service? The sheer, comfortable obliviousness of modern life felt almost criminal, a luxury they were about to have brutally revoked. His mind flashed back to the moment he realized the full terror of his calculations. He had used a complex retro-calculation model based on the Sumerian data points, projecting the point of origin of 3i Atlas back 3,600 years, the exact cycle of Nibiru. The result was not a random corner of the galaxy. It pointed precisely towards the direction of Nibiru's supposed aphelion, where it spent most of its time in the cosmic cold. This wasn't a coincidence. It was confirmation of a highly advanced, cyclical reconnaissance mission. The Anunnaki were coming home, and the scouts had arrived to prepare the way. He pulled his collar tighter. The carriage was warm, but a pervasive coldness had taken root in his soul. He had contacted a single trusted former colleague, a specialist in deep-sky radio astronomy, Professor Moira MacLeod, who maintained a virtually forgotten research station on the Shetland Islands, a true bolt hole, far from the reach of Whitehall bureaucracy or the eyes of the European Space Agency. Moira owed him a favor from decades ago. A favor involving a particularly embarrassing incident concerning a visiting Nobel laureate and a catastrophically broken radio telescope dish. He prayed she would honor it now, for this was far more serious than a telescope. This was the end of the current epoch. Finch spent a tense night in a nondescript Glasgow hotel, the kind of establishment where the carpets were aggressively patterned, designed to hide stains, and the tea tasted faintly of chlorine from the local water supply. He didn't sleep, instead opting for a series of short, intense bursts of encryption work. He meticulously erased his digital footprint. Every email, every bank transaction, every recorded mobile phone location, all scrubbed, fragmented, and obfuscated using military-grade encryption software he had secretly developed years ago, a precautionary measure he now realized was essential for survival. He was disappearing not just from the academic grid, but from the state security apparatus he knew would soon be mobilized against him. He had learned enough about government protocol to know that the moment a major scientific finding threatens global stability or threatens the established power structure, it ceases to be science and becomes national security. And in the United Kingdom, national security meant the swift, silent intervention of GCHQ, Government Communications Headquarters, and MI5. He imagined the teams already compiling his psychological profile in a sterile, windowless room in Cheltenham. Highly intelligent, anti-establishment tendencies, prone to obsessive behavior, significant threat of unauthorized disclosure, handled with extreme prejudice. The irony wasn't lost on him. He wasn't trying to destabilize the nation. He was trying to prepare it for contact with its creators. But governments prefer comfortable lies to inconvenient truths, especially when the truth involves ceding control to ancient alien overlords who might demand tribute or, worse, gold. He used the hotel's business center, a place he knew would be under low-level surveillance, but offered physical access to print hard copies of the most damning data, the orbital residuals that could not be explained by gravity alone, the specific Sumerian texts regarding Lu Nimgir. He stored these papers inside the lining of his old, oilskin trench coat, knowing that digital evidence could be wiped remotely by unseen hands, but paper required physical retrieval, slowing down the pursuit. As he walked through the busy concourse of Glasgow Central Station, heading toward the ferry terminal that would take him closer to Moira's isolated post, he felt the familiar prickle of surveillance. It was a familiar sensation to anyone who deals in secrets, the feeling of being watched, not by a person, but by systems, by unseen algorithms designed to detect deviation. He saw two men in ill-fitting suits lingering near the newsagents, too clean, too still for casual travelers. They were reading the racing form with a detached intensity, but their eyes swept the crowd with practiced detachment, scanning faces and body language. Finch lowered his hat, adjusted the scarf high around his neck, and merged into a group of noisy football supporters heading to a match, embracing the chaos of the crowd as camouflage. He knew they wouldn't stop him yet. They wouldn't risk making a scene in a public, crowded space like a train station. They would wait until he was isolated, perhaps on the ferry, or better yet, at the remote observatory, where they could conduct a clean retrieval of his data and ensure his complete and utter silence. This gave him a window, perhaps 48 hours, to confirm his theories and get the findings out into the public domain. He checked his mobile phone one last time before smashing it with a heavy stone in a secluded corner of the platform, a sacrificial offering to the surveillance gods, ensuring its GPS and microphone were permanently disabled. From now on, his communication would be analog or highly encrypted satellite bursts. He stepped onto the ferry bound for the Shetland Islands, the salt spray immediately hitting his face, the air sharp and clean. The vastness of the North Sea stretched out before him, grey and unforgiving, a fitting metaphor for the future he was sailing towards. If you have made it this far without pausing, it's because this has deeply resonated with you. So, strengthen this content, like it now, and send it to someone who needs to see this. He found a secluded spot on the upper deck, watching the Scottish coastline recede into the mist. He couldn't shake the image of the men in suits. They represented the apparatus of denial, not malicious figures, perhaps, but functionaries dedicated to maintaining the status quo and collecting their steady government pensions. They didn't care about the Anunnaki, they cared about stability and order. And Dr. Alistair Finch was now, undeniably, an element of instability, a rogue variable threatening the entire equation. The sea wind whipped at his face, a raw reminder that he was truly alone in this monumental undertaking. You already considered the possibility, he told himself. Now you must survive long enough to prove it to a world determined to remain blind. The Shetland Islands were a study in rugged, uncompromising beauty. Treeless hills rolled down to meet the churning, icy waters of the North Atlantic. The landscape was dominated by sweeping expanses of moorland and peat bogs. The air was permanently damp, smelling strongly of peat smoke and the cold sea. The old Sullom Voe astronomical station, located high on a desolate ridge overlooking the turbulent coastline, was the definition of remoteness. It had been officially decommissioned by the University Consortium 5 years prior, deemed too expensive and too weather-beaten to maintain in the relentless Shetland climate. But Professor Moira MacLeod, stubborn and fiercely independent, had managed to keep a skeleton crew and the primary radio telescope operational, funded by obscure private grants linked to niche deep space research. When Finch finally arrived, battered and wind-chilled after the long ferry journey and a bumpy, bone-shaking Land Rover ride across untamed terrain, the atmosphere was exactly what he needed: professional isolation combined with cutting-edge technology. Professor MacLeod, a woman built like a brick outhouse, whose features were permanently weathered by the North Sea gales and possessing a gaze that could cut through theoretical physics, greeted him with a single, knowing nod. There was no need for pleasantries or detailed, time-wasting explanations. Moira understood the inherent gravity of unorthodoxy in the world of astronomy. "Alistair," she said, her voice rough from the wind and years of shouting over satellite dish movements, possessing the distinct clipped accent of the far north. "You look like you've seen a ghost, or perhaps calculated one." She didn't smile. This was serious business. Finch merely handed her the small encrypted USB drive containing his most vital calculations, his entire life's work reduced to a single plastic stick. "Moira, I need the dish pointed at the known trajectory of 3i Atlas. Continuous tracking. I need high-gain spectral analysis, looking specifically for structured radio frequency bursts, non-natural harmonics, and I need absolute secrecy. We are compromised." Moira took the drive, her expression unreadable, weighing the request. She led him through the maze of cables, cooling units, and vintage analog equipment that constituted the observatory's nerve center. The main room, though freezing despite the massive industrial heating units, hummed with suppressed activity. It smelled of ozone, oil, and dust accumulated over decades. The central feature was the enormous control panel governing the 25-meter radio dish outside, currently shrouded in thick, swirling fog, blending into the grey sky. "The Atlas data is public domain, Alistair, you know that. Everyone is tracking it, from Jodrell Bank to the Americans. They are tracking the gravitational solution, Moira. They're looking for where gravity dictates it should be. I'm tracking the intentionality. The deviation isn't noise. It's a signature of correction. We're looking for evidence of propulsion, of minds at work, adjusting its path minute by minute." Finch spoke with the conviction of a zealot. Moira, a pragmatist through and through, scoffed lightly but didn't argue. She had seen too many odd things in the cosmos to dismiss anything outright, especially when it came from Alistair Finch, whose occasional flashes of genuine, paradigm-shattering genius often outweighed his flaws. She directed him to a small, cluttered office overlooking the turbulent water, a space traditionally used for weather monitoring. "The satellite link is secure, Alistair. Everything is shielded by a thick layer of rock and lead. If GCHQ is listening, they'll just hear static and my bloody terrible opera recordings. Now sit down, have a proper cuppa, and tell me precisely what the Sumerians have to do with a hypervelocity object from the Triangulum Galaxy." Finch began to explain, his voice low and urgent, detailing the correlation between the Lu-Nimgir texts and the baffling orbital mechanics of 3i Atlas. He described the cyclical nature of the Anunnaki return, the ancient imperative for gold, the mass genetic engineering, the entire horrifying cosmology stitched together from fringe science and dusty tablets. Moira listened intently, occasionally interjecting with sharp technical questions about orbital inclination, energy requirements, and the feasibility of interstellar propulsion systems operating near solar masses. The air outside was thick with the mist, a perfect cloak for their illicit collaboration. Finch set up his portable workstation, integrating his refined algorithms with the powerful processing capacity of the observatory's mainframe. He was preparing to run the simulation that would either confirm his status as a brilliant pioneer or finally cement his reputation as a harmless lunatic. The stakes were no longer just professional. They were existential, encompassing the fate of the entire planet. The long, unforgiving night descended upon the Shetland Islands, cloaking the observatory in impenetrable darkness, save for the faint, diffused light pollution leaking from the remote oil terminals far in the distance, shining faintly against the low clouds. Inside the control room, the tension was palpable. Finch and Moira had been working non-stop for 18 hours, fueled by strong black coffee, stale biscuits, and the adrenaline of potential discovery. The radio dish, exposed to the howling gales outside, periodically shuddered with tremendous force, transferring minute seismic vibrations into the very foundation of the building. Finch was focusing on the spectral analysis of 3I Atlas. Conventional wisdom suggested the object was composed primarily of water ice and silicates, typical comet material, a fluffy cosmic snowball. But Finch's custom detector was looking at the non-visible electromagnetic spectrum, searching for unusual energy signatures, signatures that might indicate an active energy field, propulsion system, or even the subtle hum of life support deep within the structure. "Run the tachyonic signature filter again, Moira," Finch commanded, his voice hoarse from lack of rest and overuse. "Alistair, that's insane. Tachyons are purely theoretical particles, if they exist at all. You'll get nothing but thermal noise, you bloody fool." Moira complied nonetheless, tapping complex commands into the ancient but reliable Unix terminal. She was skeptical of the specific technique, but the data anomalies Finch had already shown her were sufficient to suspend disbelief. The non-gravitational acceleration of Atlas was 4 times greater than any previous observation. This anomaly alone demanded radical, non-conventional solutions. The screen filled with complex graphs, oscillating wildly. Most channels showed the expected cosmic background radiation, the static hiss of the universe, the background noise of infinity. But then, on the highly sensitive filter designed to pick up structured energy emissions, a definitive, organized pattern emerged. It wasn't a constant signal, but a rhythmic pulse, a repeating sequence of harmonics in the low-frequency radio band. It was structured, mathematically precise, utilizing prime number sequencing and utterly non-natural in origin. "There," Finch breathed, pointing a shaking finger at the screen, tapping the glass with a worn fingernail. "Look at the periodicity. It follows a perfect prime number sequence, repeating every 12.3 hours. That's not random outgassing, Moira. That's a beacon. That is a deliberate, intentional signal." Moira leaned closer, her thick brows furrowed in intense concentration. She was trying desperately to find a conventional explanation. Faulty equipment, cosmic ray interference, terrestrial contamination bleeding into the detection array. But the signal was clean, distinct, and originating precisely from the calculated vector of 3I Atlas triangulated against the background stars. "The frequency, it's too deep," she muttered, her scientific objectivity battling against her rising disbelief. "If it was designed for communication with us, it would be in the waterhole, in the hydrogen band, frequencies known to all intelligent life. This is designed to be heard only by something massive, something far away, requiring immense power to receive." Finch felt a surge of cold triumph coursing through his exhausted body. This confirmed his theory completely. 3I Atlas was not communicating with Earth. It was broadcasting a signal to Nibiru, its homeworld, confirming its safe and successful arrival in the solar system, serving as the advance warning system for the Anunnaki fleet that followed in Nibiru's gravitational wake. The Herald had delivered its message. He started running the signal through a reverse engineering algorithm, trying to isolate the data packets and decipher the content. The structure was undeniably complex, an indication of immense technological sophistication, utilizing encryption far beyond current human capability. This wasn't just a hunk of rock propelled by an engine. It was an intricately engineered machine, perhaps even deliberately cloaked, to appear like a mundane comet or asteroid to the casual observer. The sophistication of the deception was as terrifying as the technology itself. The weight of the disclosure crashed down on him again, heavier than before. The truth was now confirmed by hard physics, validated by the very instruments designed to measure the universe. They were being visited, not by curious explorers seeking dialogue, but by absentee landlords preparing to reclaim their property. If you have made it this far without pausing, it's because this has deeply resonated with you. So, strengthen this content. Like it now and send it to someone who needs to see this. Moira turned away from the screen, walking stiffly to the narrow window, pulling aside the heavy blackout curtain just enough to glimpse the raging sea outside. The storm seemed to mirror the turmoil inside the room, a violent, chaotic reflection. "Alistair," she said, her voice barely a whisper, strained by the implications. "If this signal is real, if those are intentional pulses, then we have a problem far beyond a mere anomalous orbit. We have intelligent life announcing its presence. And if your Sumerian texts are correct, we have a catastrophic species-level problem." She exhaled slowly, the breath fogging the glass immediately. "What happens now?" Finch knew the answer. They fight to get the truth out before the Silence Squad finds them, before they become just another piece of suppressed history. Day 2 brought no respite, only increased fatigue and the chilling realization that time was rapidly running out. The persistent signal from 3i Atlas continued its rhythmic broadcast, a steady mathematical drumbeat echoing the arrival of a distant, powerful force. Finch and Moira had moved from mere detection to aggressive decryption, attempting to crack the alien cryptographic shell. They isolated the prime number sequence, which appeared to serve as the packet header, defining the structure of the data that followed, like an interstellar address system. The data itself was complex, highly compressed, and fundamentally alien in its mathematical representation. It wasn't based on human mathematics or physics concepts. It contained elements that Finch tentatively identified as topological algorithms, complex geometries describing vast distances and temporal shifts, perhaps even communication through higher dimensions. He focused his efforts on the portions he believed contained navigational data, trying to pinpoint the precise destination of both 3i Atlas and the predicted trajectory of Nibiru. He remembered the old Sumerian phrase, Kaigal, the Great Place, often interpreted by archaeologists as the center of their operations on Earth, typically located in ancient Mesopotamia. But Finch was beginning to suspect a far more insidious global arrangement, a network of operational hubs designed to withstand millennia of neglect. "The acceleration curve," Moira pointed out, tracing a delicate line on a projected holographic map of the solar system. "The vector shift is minor, almost imperceptible to standard telemetry, but it's there, repeated every 12.3 hours. Atlas is making fine-tuned corrections, far too precise for any known natural phenomenon. It's not just passing through, it's being guided toward a specific rendezvous point, likely outside the plane of the ecliptic, possibly behind Jupiter or Saturn, a blind spot for our current ground-based systems, placed there intentionally." Finch's attention, however, was fixed on a small recurring data cluster he had managed to decompress. Symbols that appeared to be complex chemical formulae repeatedly broadcast within the beacon signal. They weren't biological or organic in nature. They looked like equations for isotopic refinement, highly specific industrial processes. "It's the gold," Finch whispered, the realization sinking in like a stone in cold water, heavy and certain. "It's always been the gold. These are not general communication protocols, Moira. These are resource assessment reports. They are checking the status of the materials they left behind, comparing current terrestrial atmospheric conditions with historical data. They are calculating the yield, ensuring their ancient investment is still viable." The Anunnaki hadn't returned for spiritual renewal or diplomatic dialogue. They were returning to harvest what they had planted millennia ago. And if humanity, the genetically engineered workforce, was an impediment to that harvest, the ancient texts offered a terrifying preview of their methodology: destruction, cleansing, and re-establishment of the worker species. The biblical Great Flood, Finch theorized, might have been a previous reset operation, an expedient measure to clear the land when the old workforce became too numerous or recalcitrant, maintaining planetary stability for their own future extraction. Moira sat back, rubbing her eyes with the heel of her hand, the exhaustion battling the adrenaline. The cold, objective data was aligning too perfectly with the frightening mythological framework. The sheer scope of the conspiracy, or rather, the millennia-long reality, was overwhelming. A burden too great for two people in a remote hut on the Shetland Islands. "We need to get this to the world, Alistair," she said firmly, her resolve hardening. "We can't hold this. If governments are actively suppressing the truth, we bypass the governments entirely, flooding the channels they seek to control." Finch agreed, but the risk was immense. They needed a clean, undeniable package of evidence: the orbital deviation calculations, the Sumerian textual correlations, and the hard proof of the structured radio signal. Everything had to be irrefutable, able to stand up to the immediate brutal counter-campaign of misinformation they knew would follow. Meanwhile, the faint threat of MI5 lingered, a phantom limb that Finch felt constantly twitching. He checked the satellite communication log on his auxiliary laptop. He noticed a persistent, low-power ping attempting to handshake with their system. A sophisticated attempt at lateral hacking, probably originating from a secure government facility in Cheltenham. The fuzz was definitely closing in. The Shetland gale intensified, rattling the large windows of the control room with increasing violence. It was the kind of fierce, horizontal rain and wind that seemed determined to scrub the islands clean of any human presence or inconvenient data. Finch and Moira were engaged in a desperate race against the clock, preparing the data package for global dissemination. They decided on a multi-pronged approach: highly encrypted files uploaded to various decentralized servers known for their resilience, coupled with an analog data dump, physical copies, to trusted contacts in journalism and independent scientific research across Europe. Finch was using the observatory's powerful satellite uplink, designed for deep space communication with distant probes, to initiate the broadcast. He bypassed all standard protocols, creating a short, high-energy burst containing the full analysis and the chilling conclusion. The transmission window was narrow, requiring careful timing to avoid detection by established governmental monitoring systems, particularly the massive dishes operated by GCHQ, designed to intercept any unusual high-power communications originating from the UK. "Transmission sequence initiated," Moira reported, her fingers dancing across the console, every movement precise and efficient. "Bandwidth is maxed. We have 60 seconds of clean transmission before the system risks thermal overload, blowing out the main relays." Finch watched the progress bar inch across the screen, hypnotized by the digital meter ticking towards completion. He felt a profound sense of defiance. For years, the scientific community had mocked him. Governments had dismissed his inquiries, and now he was forcing the truth onto the world stage, whether they liked it or not. This was his legacy, the definitive act of his discredited career. But the Silent Squad was faster than he anticipated, and infinitely more ruthless. At 45 seconds into the transmission, the lights in the control room flickered violently, plunging the room into momentary darkness, then surging back with a blinding, painful flash. All the monitors instantly went black, followed by a piercing, high-pitched whine from the servers, the sound of critical components failing catastrophically. "EMP!" Moira yelled, frantically hitting the emergency disconnects, trying to salvage the system. "They didn't just hack us, Alistair. They fried the local grid using electromagnetic pulse technology. That signal was too powerful for a remote hack. They had to be physically close." Finch rushed to the control panel. The transmission progress bar was frozen at 88%. The uplink dish outside had ceased rotation, locked solid, perhaps physically damaged by the surge of energy. He saw faint smoke curling up from several vents in the main console. "Did it get out? All of it?" Finch demanded, his voice tight with desperation, his heart hammering in his chest. Moira checked the logs on a hardened, battery-powered auxiliary laptop, a relic she kept protected in a Faraday cage. "Partial upload. 88% of the data packet made it to the initial receiver node in Iceland. We don't know if the chain reaction continued, but the primary evidence, the signal analysis and the coordinates, is floating somewhere in the digital ether. It's recoverable, Alistair. It's out there." The silence in the room was deafening, replacing the rhythmic hum of the machinery. They had been compromised, their location pinpointed the moment the high-power transmission began. The sheer speed and brutality of the response confirmed their greatest fear. Official suppression was not passive denial, it was aggressive, technological, and immediate. They knew. The powers that be had known about the Anunnaki cycle for years, perhaps centuries, and were prepared to use massive force to keep the secret buried beneath layers of denial and technological interference. Finch looked out the window. Despite the raging storm, he saw something else, a faint rhythmic flashing light far down the access road, approaching the observatory with speed. Headlights, several vehicles, heavy-duty, probably unmarked Land Rovers. If you have made it this far without pausing, it's because this has deeply resonated with you. So, strengthen this content, like it now, and send it to someone who needs to see this. "They're here," Finch stated flatly, grabbing his trench coat and the hard copies of the data, the analog backup, the last physical remnants of his work. "They won't just take the data, Moira. They'll take us. They'll sweep this clean and call it a tragic industrial accident caused by the gale." Moira was already moving toward the back exit, a narrow, unmarked metal door leading to the desolate ridge. "Move, Alistair. If we can't broadcast the truth, we become the truth. We need witnesses." The terrifying realization was that GCHQ and MI5 weren't just protecting a secret. They were protecting the Anunnaki's operational security, ensuring the Heralds could continue their work unmolested. The escape into the tempest was brutal, a desperate flight into the elemental chaos of the North Sea weather. The ridge was slick with rain, mud, and exposed to the full, relentless power of the North Atlantic wind. Finch, hampered by his age, exhaustion, and unsuitable city attire, struggled to keep pace with Moira, whose rural upbringing had prepared her for such savage conditions. The wind howled like a banshee, tearing at their clothing and threatening to throw them down the steep rocky slopes toward the churning icy sea far below. Behind them, the glare of the approaching headlights cut through the gloom, momentarily illuminating the scene like a theatrical spotlight. They heard the muffled but distinct sound of official car doors slamming, a sound of finality and authority, the state machinery asserting itself. They were being hunted by the full, silent force of the British security state, mobilized with alarming efficiency. "The chopper will be here soon," Moira shouted over the roar of the wind, pulling Finch by the arm, urging him forward. "We need to get to the boat shed. It's our only chance of putting distance between us and the fuzz." Finch's lungs burned with the effort, his chest constricting painfully with every gasp of cold, damp air. Every step was a battle against the elements and the crushing weight of his failure to fully disseminate the data. Had he saved the world, or merely signed his own execution warrant? The question echoed in his mind, sharp and insistent, battling against the sound of the wind. He thought about the terrifying implications of the Anunnaki's imminent return. If they were as powerful and technologically advanced as the Sumerian texts suggested, capable of planetary-scale engineering, mass genetic manipulation, and controlling interstellar objects like 3I Atlas, then humanity was nothing more than a poorly maintained livestock herd. valuable only for its labor and resources. The notion extinguished any lingering heroic idealism he might have held. This wasn't a fight for freedom, it was a desperate scramble for survival and disclosure against forces both terrestrial, MI5, and cosmic, the Anunnaki. He stumbled, catching himself on a jagged outcrop of schist rock, scraping his hand raw. He looked back and saw figures silhouetted against the observatory lights, moving systematically across the ridge, sweeping the ground with powerful torches. They were professionals, probably Special Branch or a highly trained GCHQ retrieval team. They wouldn't shoot. They needed him alive, or at least his brain intact, to glean any residual knowledge. But they would use any means necessary to secure the information and ensure silence, wrapping him up neatly in the process. Moira reached the crest of a small hillock and pointed down toward a small, sheltered inlet, barely visible in the darkness. "There, the shed! We can make it!" The shed housed Moira's small, sturdy fishing vessel, the astronomer's ruin, used for local research and avoiding the bureaucratic oversight of the official maritime agencies. It was their only hope of navigating the treacherous coastal waters and reaching the nearest mainland port, days away from official scrutiny and roadblock checkpoints. As they scrambled down the final slope, Finch's mind raced through the data he had managed to transmit. The 88% upload contained the most critical elements: the structured signal analysis, the non-gravitational coefficients, and the coordinates for the projected arrival path of Nibiru. Even if the entire chain failed, those segments, even fragmented, would trigger intense investigation among the few independent researchers who received them. The truth, once launched, is difficult to completely recapture and contain. He was struck by the monumental nature of his discovery. All the cozy assumptions of human exceptionalism, our progress, our philosophies, our unique relationship with a benevolent creator, were founded on ignorance of the Anunnaki's cyclical intervention. The true history of Earth was about to be forcibly rewritten by the subjects themselves, in a script dictated from the stars. They reached the boat shed, the interior smelling strongly of diesel and brine. Moira quickly fumbled with the complex locks, her movements precise despite her shaking hands. The sound of shouting drifted closer from the ridge above. They didn't have minutes, they had seconds before the arrival of the Silence Squad. Moira expertly piloted the small vessel, the astronomer's ruin, through the churning waves, hugging the coastline to avoid the full fury of the open sea. The boat, though old, was reliable, built to withstand the relentless battering of the North Sea. Finch, hunched in the small cabin, felt the motion acutely, the diesel fumes mixing with the damp coldness and the residual adrenaline. The lights of the observatory were rapidly receding, soon swallowed by the darkness and the driving rain. They were safe, for now, but exposed to a greater threat, the sea itself and the persistent reach of the state security apparatus. They knew their escape route would be quickly identified, and within hours, Coast Guard vessels or even military patrol boats might be mobilized to intercept them, framing the capture as a rescue operation after a maritime accident. Finch pulled out the auxiliary laptop Moira had saved and a small battery-powered satellite terminal, their last means of communication, heavily shielded and operating outside official bandwidths. He needed to run the final trajectory calculation, integrating the decoded partial coordinates from the 3i Atlas signal with the Sumerian temporal cycle. He needed to know when and where the Anunnaki intended to make landfall, or at least establish their primary base of operations. He began the complex calculation, the rhythmic rocking of the boat adding a surreal layer of difficulty to the intricate programming. The screen glowed faintly, illuminating his strained, exhausted features. He input the crucial data points, the slight nudges in 3i Atlas's orbit that confirmed its controlled path. The results began to compile, extrapolating Nibiru's likely position and its closest orbital proximity to Earth. refining the 3,600-year estimate into a precise 2-decade window. The result was staggering, not just in its precision, but in its profound implication for human civilization. Nibiru, the colossal homeworld, was projected to be visually observable within the next 2 decades, but the gravitational impact and initial advance ships would arrive much sooner, operating ahead of the main body. But the Lu-Nimgir objects, Oumuamua and 3I Atlas, weren't navigating towards Nibiru's projected path. They were maneuvering slightly off-plane, converging on a specific, predetermined location within the inner solar system, currently masked by solar radiation and orbital debris. This location was likely intended as a secure staging area, or perhaps a massive, ancient artificial repair station that could have been placed millennia ago, waiting for activation by the Heralds. If you have made it this far without pausing, it's because this has deeply resonated with you. So strengthen this content, like it now, and send it to someone who needs to see this. Finch reran the coordinates, eliminating all potential errors introduced by the rocking of the boat. The staging zone was identified, a point far past the orbit of Mars, but where a massive, ancient artificial structure could have been placed millennia ago, waiting for activation. This was where the Anunnaki fleet, riding the coattails of Nibiru's immense gravitational field, would slow down, rearm, and prepare for planetary contact. They weren't just observing. They were establishing a foothold, a beachhead in the inner solar system. This realization changed everything. The threat wasn't a return in 20 years, but an active, covert preparation happening now. The global suppression efforts weren't about mitigating future panic. They were about securing the arrival zone from human interference. The governments knew, and they were cooperating with the agenda of the returning gods. The sheer, chilling scope of this complicity turned Finch's stomach, tasting bile in his throat. As dawn broke, painting the Shetland sky in bruised shades of grey and purple, the astronomer's ruin finally found refuge in a narrow, hidden cove on a larger, uninhabited island. A place Moira knew intimately from years of avoiding tourists and maritime bureaucracy. They were exhausted, chilled to the bone, but alive. The boat was secured against the rugged cliff face, sheltered from the powerful currents and the watchful eye of the sky. Finch, having warmed himself slightly with strong, bitter tea from a thermos, returned immediately to the data. He finalized the analysis of the gold refinement formulae transmitted by 3I Atlas. The equations were incredibly specific, indicating a demand for extremely pure, monoatomic gold, a material the Anunnaki needed for their planetary atmospheric repair, but which also possesses unique superconductive and spiritual properties highly valued by ancient cultures, leading to human reverence. The focus shifted from what is happening in space to why are the governments of Earth involved in the cover-up. Finch began to weave the thread of complicity. If the Anunnaki needed gold, and if they considered Earth their property, then any terrestrial government aware of the cyclical return would face a stark choice: suicidal resistance, which guaranteed destruction, or collaboration, which promised survival, albeit subjugated, under the new regime. He recalled obscure documents he had seen decades ago during his brief stint consulting for the Ministry of Defense, references to Project Echelon Nitu and Deep Sky Protocol Omega. These were not standard protocols for detecting alien invasions. They were administrative frameworks for high-level continuity of government scenarios tied to non-terrestrial events, focusing on transition and accommodation. They weren't planning to fight. They were planning to transition power smoothly to the superior civilization. The British establishment, steeped in tradition and adherence to hierarchy, would likely view collaboration as the most logical, rational choice. Surrender now to ensure continued, albeit subjugated, existence later, preserving the essential fabric of power. This explained the efficiency of GCHQ's response, the total silence from the mainstream scientific bodies, and the active defamation campaign against anyone touching the Nibiru Anunnaki hypothesis. The security forces were acting as the loyal servants of the returning masters. Finch suddenly felt a deeper, more profound despair, a moral sickness. It wasn't just the return of ancient gods they faced, it was the betrayal of their own species by its chosen leaders, a deal struck in secret ages ago. The men in ill-fitting suits were not fighting for the crown or for democracy. They were ensuring their place, perhaps as minor viceroys or administrators, in the new celestial feudal system. He looked at Moira, who was calmly mending a section of frayed rope, her face grim, accepting the terrifying reality with pragmatic composure. "Moira," he said quietly, "if we get this out, we aren't just revealing aliens. We're exposing a global covenant of silence, a deal made in the shadows by those sworn to protect us, a deal that sacrifices all of humanity." She paused, looking up at him, the grey light reflecting in her steely eyes. "Then we make sure the world knows who their true shepherds are, Alistair. The price of denial is too high." She understood that the disclosure of the Anunnaki was simultaneously the indictment of the modern state. This was why they were being hunted with such ferocity. They weren't just fringe scientists. They were dangerous political dissidents threatening the global deep state structure. The fight was no longer astronomical, it was political, theological, and intensely personal. 3 days into their flight, Finch and Moira had established a crude but effective base of operations inside an abandoned fishing hut near the cove. They relied on stored rations and the occasional bit of foraging. The constant sound of the sea was a reminder of their isolation, yet also their vulnerability to discovery by patrol craft. Finch had one final, crucial calculation to perform, pinpointing the specific terrestrial destination, the Kigal, the operational center the Anunnaki would use upon their arrival and during their cyclic stay. This location would not be chosen randomly. It would be historically significant, geographically stable, and perhaps still connected to the ancient gold mining operations or major energy grids established millennia ago. He overlaid the ancient Sumerian astronomical charts, which depicted celestial alignments coinciding with major construction projects like the pyramids and ziggurats, with modern geological surveys highlighting high-concentration gold deposits and ancient, unexplained geomagnetic energy signatures, often dismissed as natural anomalies. The theory was simple. The Anunnaki, masters of geomancy and planetary mechanics, would choose a location that maximizes resource extraction and minimizes atmospheric instability during Nibiru's disruptive passage through the solar system. Finch spent hours refining the geodetic coordinates, cross-referencing astronomical data points from 4000 BCE with contemporary satellite imaging. He worked through the mid-morning, the light harsh and unforgiving through the cracked window pane. He traced the lines of force, the energy nodes, the places where the Earth's own magnetosphere seemed to align precisely with the incoming trajectory of 3I Atlas, suggesting a destination programmed into the Heralds navigation system. The coordinates finally solidified, pointing primarily to an area in the Middle East, near the ancient Mesopotamian plains, but specifically a largely unexplored underground complex near the confluence of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the precise historical location of the first Anunnaki cities. However, the data also suggested a secondary, critical point of interest, far away from the Middle East, a massive power conduit structure that could be reactivated remotely. He zoomed in on the secondary coordinate set. His blood ran cold as the grid lines focused. The location was not a remote desert or a forgotten ruin. It was located deep within the Wiltshire countryside in England, directly under the ancient monument of Stonehenge. If you have made it this far without pausing, it's because this has deeply resonated with you. So, strengthen this content, like it now, and send it to someone who needs to see this. Stonehenge, the mystery of the ages, was not a druidic temple or a calendar. It was a beacon, a massive power generator, or perhaps an emergency landing pad strategically placed to receive the incoming herald or the first wave of Anunnaki ships. This revelation was a geopolitical nightmare, planting the crisis right in the heart of the UK. If the Anunnaki intended to activate Stonehenge, the ancient British Isles would become ground zero for the new epoch. The governmental suppression, the military sensitivity around Salisbury Plain, the decades of obfuscation regarding the monument's true purpose, it all suddenly made horrifying logical sense. The conspiracy wasn't thousands of miles away. It was rooted deep in the chalk landscape of England, protected by layers of military secrecy and historical misdirection. The third night found Finch and Moira preparing their final transmission. The urgency was absolute. They had to get the coordinates of both the staging zone and the Stonehenge beacon out. If the world knew the targets, they could demand answers from their governments before the arrival sequence was complete, before the heralds finished their reconnaissance. They had salvaged enough power for one final low-energy satellite burst, aimed at a network of independent journalists and ethical hackers Finch had cultivated over the years, a network known only by the codename The Dissidents. This network was their last hope, decentralized and resilient enough to handle the inevitable government denial. Finch reviewed the entire package one last time. The irrefutable evidence of the non-gravitational acceleration of 3I Atlas, the structured signal harmonics proving artificial intelligence, the deciphered chemical formulae indicating gold harvest, and the final, terrifying coordinates pointing to the Stonehenge complex. This data package, if received and taken seriously, would ignite a global firestorm of panic and revelation. Moira stood guard outside the fishing hut, wrapped tightly against the cold, listening intently for the sound of helicopter blades or the low growl of patrol boats. The silence was broken only by the crash of the waves against the rocks, a constant primal rhythm. Finch activated the small terminal. The connection was tentative, clinging precariously to a distant relay satellite. He composed a brief, stark introduction to the data dump, stripped of all academic jargon. The Anunnaki are not myth. The cycle is complete. The heralds have arrived. Stonehenge is the key. Seek the truth before the cover-up becomes permanent. He attached the heavily encrypted files and initiated the upload sequence. The upload process was excruciatingly slow, measured in individual kilobytes, each one a precious unit of truth inching toward freedom. Every second felt like an eternity, a lifetime balanced on the precarious thread of a weak satellite signal. Finch looked at his reflection in the dark screen, a man nearing collapse, his tweed jacket damp and stained, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and fierce determination. He had gambled his life, his career, and his sanity on this singular moment of dissemination. He thought back to the comfortable routine of Oxford, the scent of old paper and lukewarm tea. That life was gone, replaced by the primal fear of the hunted. But he had chosen this path. He had chosen truth over comfort, disclosure over complicity. As the progress bar crept toward the 90% mark, the satellite terminal began to overheat dangerously, giving off a sharp, acrid burning smell of plastic and ozone. He pressed on, willing the data to transmit, knowing that 95% was the minimum required for the essential files to be intact and readable by the receiving network. The core realization that settled over him was the terrifying simplicity of the Anunnaki's nature. They were not malicious demons or spiritual saviors. They were merely advanced engineers executing a millennia-old project. Humanity was simply collateral, a necessary byproduct of their true goal, the stabilization and preservation of Nibiru through gold refinement. Their return was an accounting exercise, and Earth was merely a quarry, a resource they intended to exploit. The screen flashed green. Transmission complete. Finch slumped back, the relief momentary, immediately overwhelmed by renewed dread. He had done his part. The information was out. Now came the reckoning. He dismantled the satellite terminal, smashing the complex electronic components with a heavy stone, ensuring it could not be tracked or used against them. Outside, Moira suddenly gave a low, sharp whistle, a warning call. Finch looked up, tense. He could hear it too now, a rhythmic, powerful thrumming sound, growing rapidly louder, approaching from the mainland direction, slicing through the thick air. Not a boat, a helicopter. The authorities had found them, utilizing advanced thermal detection or airborne radar. The helicopter noise quickly swelled into a deafening roar, whipping the water in the cove into a violent, frothing spray. It was a black, unmarked military chopper, a clear sign that this was not a civilian police operation, but a specialized GCHQ MI5 retrieval effort, authorized at the highest levels of the state. Finch scrambled out of the hut, clutching the remnants of his analog data, the paper copies of the Sumerian texts and the trajectory printouts. The physical proof. Moira stood ready, holding a flare gun, prepared to signal or possibly sabotage their pursuers with a bright distraction. The helicopter descended rapidly, forcing them to shield their faces against the torrent of wind and sea spray. Men in dark, tactical gear rappelled down onto the slick rocks, moving with swift, professional efficiency honed by years of training in remote environments. There was no negotiation, only command, delivered with cold authority. Dr. Finch and Professor McLeod, stand down immediately and surrender your devices. The voice was amplified, booming over the rotor wash, emotionless and absolute. Finch looked at Moira. Their eyes exchanged a final, defiant message. They had failed to escape capture, but they had succeeded in transmission. The truth was airborne, distributed, waiting to be discovered. "You can take me!" Finch shouted, his voice barely audible even to Moira over the storm of the rotors. "But you cannot retrieve the data. It's gone. You should be preparing for the arrival, not covering up the evidence." One of the tactical officers approached, his face obscured by a ballistic visor. He carried no visible firearms, but his demeanor exuded lethal competence, the silent threat of overwhelming force. He reached for Finch's arm. Finch felt a bizarre, profound calm wash over him. His job was done. He had illuminated the hidden connection between the vastness of the cosmos and the tiny, dusty records of ancient Sumer. He had confirmed that the strange, silent messengers, the three-eye Atlas objects, were indeed the Heralds, sent to announce the return of the forgotten gods, and that the ultimate destination was right here in the ancient heart of Britain. If this content has truly opened your mind, comment below. I made it to the end. That helps me understand who is really seeking knowledge beyond the surface. Like the video, subscribe to the channel now and turn on the bell because the next episodes will go even deeper. And don't leave without clicking the next video. It's the continuation of this journey. As the officer secured Finch's wrists with industrial-strength zip ties, the astrophysicist looked one last time out at the turbulent sea, knowing that the real turbulence was just beginning, a global storm of disbelief and revelation. The question wasn't if the Anunnaki would return, but what humanity would do now that the heralds had arrived, activated the ancient beacons at Stonehenge, and signaled their masters that the stage was set. Will we rise up against our ancient overlords, or embrace the comfortable lie of subjugation offered by our own complicit governments? The black helicopter lifted Finch and Moira into the churning sky, carrying them toward indefinite detention and official silence. But far above them, hurtling across the dark gulf of space, the structured radio pulse of Three-Eye Atlas continued its broadcast, a chilling lullaby to the approaching massive shadow of Nibiru and the cyclical reckoning it promised.